On a warm June night in 2009, one of the most advanced passenger jets in the world lifted off into the Atlantic sky and then vanished. No mayday call, no radar trace, no witnesses. And perhaps the most unsettling part is this: the aircraft disappeared during the phase of flight considered the safest, the cruise portion. Air France Flight 447, an Airbus A330 carrying 228 people from Rio de Janeiro to Paris, should have been just another long-haul overnight journey. The plane was modern, the airline was respected. The weather, while challenging, was nothing that crews on this route hadn't seen before. Everything suggested this would be routine, but only a few hours after takeoff, the jet simply ceased to exist. No one knew why, no one knew where, and no one understood how a state-of-the-art airliner could fall out of the sky without sending a single distress signal. So the central question emerged, one that would haunt investigators for years. What could bring down a machine like this in just a matter of minutes? To uncover the answer, we need to go back to the very beginning, back to the evening of May 31, 2009, at Rio de Janeiro's International Airport. It began on the night of May 31, 2009, at Rio de Janeiro's International Airport. Inside Terminal 17, Air France Flight 447 is preparing for departure, a long overnight journey to Paris that thousands of passengers had taken before, without incident. Waiting at the gate is an Airbus A330, a wide-body twin-engine jet built around fly-by-wire technology, electronic signals replacing traditional mechanical cables. By that point in aviation history, the A330 carried a remarkable record. Since entering service in 1994, it had never been involved in a fatal crash in passenger operations. For many, it was considered one of the safest long-haul aircraft ever built. On this night, 216 passengers boarded, most of them French and Brazilian, including musicians, professors, even a Brazilian prince. Supporting them are 12 crew members, 9 cabin attendants, and 3 pilots. The cockpit team is experienced, even by long-haul standards. Captain Marc Dubois, 58 years old, brings nearly 11,000 flight hours with Bias 700 on the A330. First Officer Pierre-Cédric Bonin, at 32, is the least experienced on this aircraft type, with 807 hours on the A330. And then there's Relief Pilot David Robert, 37, who holds over 4,400 hours on the aircraft and will take over during the cruise so the captain can rest. For Air France crews, the Rio route is something of a dream assignment. After landing, they enjoy a 3-day layover at a hotel overlooking the famous Copacabana beach. And perhaps because of that relaxed schedule, Captain Dubois had slept only about an hour before the flight, spending most of his time in Rio with his girlfriend, a flight attendant and opera singer. But little of this seemed concerning. The A330 was designed with layers of invisible safety barriers. Once the flight plan was entered, the aircraft's automatic systems would handle almost everything. Pilots mostly monitored and intervened only when necessary. With a plane like this and a crew like this, no one could imagine that within just a few hours, everything would begin to unravel. And it all starts the moment Flight 447 lifts off and heads toward the open Atlantic. At 7:29 p.m. local time in Rio, 22:29 UTC, Flight 447 begins its takeoff roll. The Airbus accelerates down the runway, lifts cleanly into the night sky, and climbs without a single hiccup. Nothing about the departure hints at the storm of events that will follow. Within minutes, the aircraft settles into its initial climb, tracking northeast along the Brazilian coastline before pushing out over the open Atlantic. Once the A330 reaches its cruising altitude, flight level 350, about 35,000 feet, everything feels routine. The engines hum steadily, the cabin lights dim, the jet rides smoothly through the warm night air. Inside the cockpit, control of the aircraft is handed to First Officer Pierre-Cédric Bonin, the least experienced A330 pilot on board. Captain Dubois remains in his seat to supervise, while relief pilot David Robert heads to the crew rest area to begin his scheduled break. It's a typical pattern for a long-haul overnight flight. Autopilot is engaged. The flight follows its programmed track. The crew settles into the quiet rhythm of cruise, and the aircraft glides over the black expanse of the South Atlantic. Everything in these early moments seems exactly as it should be. But the airspace ahead is not empty, and the night they are flying into is not as calm as it appears. Just beyond the horizon lies a stretch of sky infamous among pilots, the equatorial storm belt, often described as a permanent thunderstorm highway. And it's along this path that the first signs of trouble will begin to emerge. By 1:30 a.m., June 1st, Flight 447 had been cruising for several hours when Brazil's Oceanic Control Center, Atlantico, checked in. Controllers instruct the crew to maintain flight level 350 and issue a routine reminder: weather ahead is deteriorating. Nothing unusual for this route, but still worth noting. A few minutes later, radio signals begin to fade, and at 1:49 a.m., the aircraft drops off Brazilian radar entirely. This isn't alarming, not yet. Large portions of the South Atlantic are radar white zones, places where ground-based tracking simply doesn't exist. Crews expect it. They continue flying. But inside the cockpit, First Officer Bonin watches the weather radar paint a different picture, one that's becoming harder to ignore. A massive band of storms stretches across their path. They're approaching the Intertropical Convergence Zone, or ITCZ, a region where warm, rising air fuels towering thunderheads. Pilots often call it a permanent storm corridor, because convective weather here never truly stops. Bonin suggests a climb to FL 370 to get above the turbulence. Captain Dubois rejects the idea. The aircraft is still heavy with fuel, and climbing near the jet's upper performance limit isn't safe. Bonin then proposes FL 360, an altitude not typically used for their northbound direction. Dubois declines again, preferring to hold steady, watch the radar, and adjust course only if the weather demands it. Outside, the sky grows increasingly hostile. Lightning strobes across the windshield, illuminating the flight deck in sharp flashes. Ice pellets begin tapping against the fuselage, then hammering hard enough to sound like distant drums. And then, something rarer appears. A faint blue halo shimmering around the aircraft's nose and windscreen. A sharp metallic smell, ozone, begins to fill the cockpit. For most long-haul crews, these sensations are familiar. They're part of flying through the tropics at night. But for Bonin, something about this particular storm line feels different. His unease begins to grow, and just as the environment outside turns more turbulent, more unpredictable, the captain decides it's time to leave the flight deck and take his scheduled rest. What happens next will unfold without him present. Around 2:00 a.m., Captain Dubois prepares to take his scheduled rest break. He calls relief pilot David Robert back to the cockpit. From this point on, Robert will monitor the flight, and First Officer Bonin will remain the pilot flying. Almost immediately, Robert notices a looming wall of dark cloud ahead and casually recommends, "Let's slide a bit left." A minor course correction, nothing dramatic, but Bonin doesn't react. He keeps the A330 pointed straight into the heart of the storm line. What the crew cannot see, not yet, is that they're entering a region dense with supercooled ice crystals, the kind that high-altitude convective weather produces in vast quantities. Ice pellets begin accumulating faster than the aircraft's systems can shed them. And then something critical happens. All three pitot tubes, the small sensors that measure airspeed, become obstructed by ice. At 2:10:05 a.m., the autopilot disconnects. The autothrust system disengages as well. With the autopilot offline, the A330 downgrades into a control mode with far fewer protections. The computer no longer shields the aircraft from stall or overspeed. In a matter of seconds, Flight 447 transitions from a quiet, stable cruise to a fully manual, high-workload emergency in darkness, inside storm turbulence, above the middle of the Atlantic. And the pilots, who moments earlier were simply supervising a highly automated aircraft, are suddenly forced to hand-fly a 230-ton jet through one of the most complex situations a crew can face. What Bonin does next, in the first few seconds of this transition, will define everything that follows. The moment the autopilot disconnects, the aircraft jolts. Flight 447 rolls about 8 degrees to the right, pushed by turbulence. Bonin reacts instantly, but roughly, yanking his side stick left to level the wings. The movement is abrupt, unrefined, and then, almost immediately, he pulls the stick back. That one motion sends the nose of the A330 upward. The jet begins climbing away from FL-350, not because the situation requires it, but because Bonin's instinctive response to the unexpected is to pitch up. Within seconds, the first stall warning sounds. A sharp, synthetic voice. "Stall! Stall!" But neither pilot recognizes the significance of what they just heard. Confusion begins to take hold. Bonin says, "We don't have valid speed indications." He's right, but the situation is far more dangerous than just missing numbers on a screen. Alarms begin cascading. Altitude deviation alerts, system messages, contradictory readings. None of them identify the root cause. The aircraft, meanwhile, climbs past 35,000 feet and keeps rising, even as its true airspeed continues to fall. Then, the stall warning returns, louder, persistent, unrelenting. The angle of attack has now exceeded 10 degrees, a critical threshold. The A330 reaches approximately 38,000 feet, its aerodynamic limit under these conditions, and can climb no further. The lift it needs to stay airborne collapses. The jet enters a full aerodynamic stall. But inside the cockpit, that reality doesn't register. The engines are at maximum thrust, the nose is high. Yet the entire aircraft is sinking, dropping through the sky at 10,000 to 11,000 feet per minute. Bonin continues pulling the stick back to the stop, convinced that lifting the nose is the way to make the airplane climb. In a stall, it does the opposite. It worsens the fall. Robert, realizing something is terribly wrong, tries to take control by pressing his side stick priority button. But Bonin presses his own, effectively overriding Robert's attempt. Bonin insists the jet is going too fast, a sensory illusion common in deep stalls, while the aircraft is, in fact, barely flying at all. Over and over, the cockpit fills with the mechanical voice, "Stall, stall, stall," and the descent accelerates. By the time Captain Dubois returns to the flight deck, the situation is no longer a deviation or an anomaly. It's a catastrophe already in motion. And by then, it may be far too late to pull the aircraft out of its deadly trajectory. When Captain Marc Dubois rushes back into the cockpit, he's met not with a recognizable emergency, but with chaos. Alarms are sounding, the aircraft is shaking. Bonin and Robert are speaking over each other, overwhelmed. Dubois demands, "What are you doing? What's going on?" The responses come fast, or fractured, uncertain. "We've lost control. We don't understand what's happening." Yet the truth is right in front of them. The flight instruments, the ones still operating correctly, show a massive vertical speed, thousands of feet per minute downward. Altitude is unwinding rapidly. But inside the cockpit, the pilot's perception doesn't match the reality on their displays. In a deep stall, sensory cues can deceive even experienced aviators. What feels like acceleration upward is actually the nose pitched high while the aircraft falls like a stone. By now, Flight 447 has dropped below 10,000 feet. The jet is still fully stalled, engines roaring at maximum power, wings unable to generate lift, and the nose inexplicably held high. And in this moment, Dubois finally grasps the core problem. He shouts, "No, no, notice! Don't pull up!" But it's too late. Recovering from a high-altitude stall requires time, altitude, airspeed. Flight 447 has none of these left. Seconds later, with a horizontal speed of barely 198 kilometers per hour and a vertical descent exceeding 11,000 feet per minute, the Airbus A330 slams belly first into the Atlantic Ocean. The aircraft breaks apart instantly. All 228 people aboard perish in a single catastrophic moment. Lights extinguished in the dark waters of the South Atlantic. And as the cockpit alarms fall silent, the tragedy enters a new phase, not in the sky, but far below it. Because now begins one of the most complex and costly search operations in aviation history. In the hours after the crash, silence becomes the only response anyone gets. By 4 a.m. UTC, controllers in Senegal begin calling Flight 447 repeatedly. No reply, no signal, no trace. And unlike most modern aviation accidents, there is no radar track to follow. The aircraft disappeared inside a vast, unmonitored section of the South Atlantic, a place where even knowing where to start looking is a challenge. Every hour that passes allows currents to scatter debris farther and farther from the impact site. Search aircraft from Brazil take off from Rio, sweeping the waters around the islands of Fernando de Noronha. France deploys military planes out of Senegal, and eventually sends deep-diving submarines capable of reaching 6,000 meters, hoping to locate wreckage on the ocean floor. On June 6, 2009, nearly a week after the crash, a breakthrough comes. 2 bodies are recovered, along with a suitcase containing a ticket for flight AF447. More debris follows in the days ahead, pieces of the fuselage, personal belongings, fragments of the cabin interior. But the most critical items, the flight recorders, are nowhere to be found. And without them, investigators can only speculate. Over the next 2 years, theories spread wildly. Terrorism, a mid-air explosion, electrical failure, even supernatural conjectures like the so-called Bermuda effect. None of them are grounded in evidence. Then, on April 1, 2011, after nearly 40 million in search operations, remotely operated vehicles finally located the wreckage field on the ocean floor, and with it, the 2 black boxes. 1 year later, in May 2012, France's BEA released the final report. The chain of events becomes clear. The initiating factor was pitot tube icing, which caused the airspeed indicators to fail. That failure caused the autopilot to disengage, exactly as designed. The real catastrophe came next. Continuous nose-up inputs from First Officer Bonin, which kept the aircraft in a fully stalled state for more than 4 minutes, even though the A330 itself never suffered a structural failure. A modern aircraft, a respected airline, an experienced crew. And yet, AF447 becomes the deadliest accident in Air France history, and the most severe, involving an Airbus A330. In the end, the explanation wasn't hidden in sabotage, conspiracy, or mystery. It lay at a fragile intersection of advanced technology, extreme weather, and human psychology under pressure. And from that intersection, the industry would learn lessons it could never afford to ignore. When we look back at Flight 447, we see elements that should have guaranteed safety. A cutting-edge aircraft, a global flag carrier airline, a well-trained, well-rested crew with thousands of hours of experience. But then we see the other side, a towering tropical storm, invisible ice crystals at altitude, pitot tubes freezing in seconds, and a cascade of cockpit decisions made under stress, made in confusion, made while alarms blared and instruments contradicted each other, that unfolded over just a few minutes. The tragedy of AF447 revealed a hard truth. Technology can be extraordinary, but humans remain the most critical link in the chain. In moments of crisis, how a pilot interprets or misinterprets the data in front of them can determine the fate of hundreds of lives. This accident reshaped training across the industry. Pilots now spend far more time learning how to recognize and recover from stalls, how to handle unreliable airspeed. And so the final question becomes ours to consider. In an era where automation flies most of the airplane, are we becoming too dependent on the systems we built and forgetting how to react when they demand that we take over? If you have thoughts about AF447, about technology and human decision-making in aviation, share them below. We'd love to hear your perspective. And if you want to explore more stories from the sky, the disasters, the miracles, the lessons, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.